Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Digital Law News, produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and we're just going to run through some news stories which have been coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Amelia. So my name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and the managing director of Digital Law, a law firm that focuses on the law relating to technology, digital technology in particular. So hence we do a lot of advice for people on data protection, cybersecurity, e-commerce, buying and selling goods online, and doing and saying things on social media. And we've got some quite interesting stories to discuss this week. So I'll pass over to Amelia to start taking us through them.
Thanks, Peter. So our first story today is coming from the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO. So we speak about the ICO quite a lot on the news stories, and this particular story is focusing on the Cabinet Office. So this week, the Cabinet Office have been fined £500,000, £500,000, for disclosing postal addresses of the 2020 New Year Honours recipients online. So the ICO found that the Cabinet Office failed to put appropriate technical and organisational measures in place to prevent the unauthorised information getting out online. So this is a very clear breach of data protection law. I will pass on to Peter to take us through this one a little bit further.
Thanks, Amelia. Yes, so it's indeed a very clear breach of data protection. I think the worrying thing here is that we aren't talking about a one-off exercise. Don't forget the Cabinet Office releases New Year's honours every new year, and then there's also the Queen's birthday honours that go through the Cabinet Office, and indeed whenever a Prime Minister resigns there's another honours list as well. So this isn't exactly an exercise that you think should have presented the Cabinet Office with any undue challenges. It's merely a rinse and repeat of what you've done before with a fresh set of details. So the fact they managed to then publish all 1,000 bits of personal data in relation to each person who was receiving an honour is all the more troubling. And you would hope that within government and within local authorities, given that over almost 20 years now of enforcement of data protection law in the UK, you'd think that because an awful lot of public sector authorities have been on the receiving end of enforcement, that at this point understanding of the requirements when it comes to data protection and keeping people's personal data safe and secure would mean that they should be a leading shining example really of best practice when it comes to both gathering personal data, its storage, its retention, transmission, and ultimately review and deletion. But unfortunately this piece of enforcement shows that is definitely not the case. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that it's not as though we're looking here at just high net worth individuals or all people that are in the public eye. Yes, people that get honours very often are in the public eye, but that's usually only the sort of the tip of the iceberg. The vast majority of people that receive honours are normal working people, very often at where the honour is recognising their contribution, or very often recognising a long and successful career. Very often that hasn't necessarily come in for the recognition that it deserves before. So hence people from all sections of society can be affected in a breach like this, and it will have caused a great deal of damage and upset as a result. Just a final point is the size of the fine. Of course, under GDPR, you can be fined, millions of pounds when it comes to a data protection breach. In this instance, it's only 500,000. But I think that we have to look at that, even though this breach occurred in I think it was winter 2019 to 2020 that this breach happened. So, of course, GDPR is in effect. We aren't looking at the old data protection legislation from pre-2018, of course, but the old data protection legislation used to have a top limit of £500,000. So if you sort of committed a particularly egregious breach, like, say, TalkTalk or Facebook, you got a £500,000 fine. That was the most the ICO could hit you for. Obviously, they can hit you for an awful lot more here, but you've also got to question the fact that this is just more taxpayers' money going out of the window in a very real and literal sense. So I think they've probably thought 500,000 is enough to make it clear the severity and embarrassment of this breach, while not needlessly applying a excessive monetary penalty notice. So I think that's probably the thinking that's been applied when it comes to applying a fine of this size. But I think it was only a week or two back, Amelia, that we were giving the regulator a bit of a kicking for not carrying out any actual GDPR enforcement. It was all the fines we've reported on have all been for excessive telesales and breaches of things like privacy and electronic communications rather than GDPR. So
Indeed.
It's almost like seeing an old friend again, seeing a bit of GDPR enforcement by the ICO.
Precisely, and I think the thing to watch out for is let's see what happens with this year's honours list, since we are now coming to the end of the year. Let's hope that they've learned from their mistakes.
Indeed. Let's not look at the wider political situation, but at the moment it doesn't really give you an awful lot of faith and confidence in the ability of central government to carry out exercises like this. So let's just keep our fingers crossed and hope they manage to do the exercise without incident this winter.
Exactly. So moving on to our next story. So the next story is the supermarket chain Spar has been forced to close a number of its stores following what it confirmed on Tuesday as a ransomware attack. So this isn't the first supermarket to have been hit by a ransomware attack this year, let alone actually in the last few months. I think a few weeks ago, myself and Peter were discussing how Tesco had been quite badly affected by a ransomware attack. So a spokesperson has confirmed that the nature of the incident, but there's not yet to be a criminal organisation involved. There has been allegedly 300 convenience stores that have been affected. And although some have narrowly avoided closure, they have had to switch to taking cash payments only. So I'll pass on to Peter to continue with this.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, this is more of a significant story than it might at first glance appear, because these sorts of little stores are very often the backbones for a lot of rural life. When you've only got a village that potentially, dozens, if not hundreds of homes might depend on for as being the centre to get supplies from. Very often it's a little store like a Spar, and it'll be only one store at the centre of such a village where you can get your basic commodities. So it's actually quite a key bit of infrastructure when we think about it, particularly for those who might be elderly, vulnerable, those who are caring for others, those who are caring for young children, etc. You're actually quite reliant on knowing that you can take a short walk or car journey to your local Spar and pick up the bread and the milk and whatever else you need. Therefore, it's going to be pretty frustrating to then find that you can't actually use your bank card or credit card to pay for the goods. Bear in mind, an awful lot of these rural places don't have cash points anymore. Certainly the banks are long gone. If there ever was a bank there, that will have closed an awful long time ago. There might be one of those cash points, if you're lucky, that might charge you commission on the amount that you're wanting to draw out. So you're going to be somewhat loath to have to actually use that to draw out cash, to then use cash to buy your shopping if you arrive at the Spar not knowing that it's hamstrung because of having been hit. So we're seeing here a real practical impact to an awful lot of people from these stores being affected. I mean, we did indeed cover that story the other week regarding Tesco, but if a big Tesco is compromised by this sort of thing, well, you can just go down the road to the nearest Sainsbury's. It's not the end of the world. But it's actually quite a serious imposition if you live very rurally. And I think we sometimes forget, therefore, the impact that something like this can have on the more widely distributed communities around the country. Certainly in Wales, certainly in Scotland, north of England, in the southwest, etc. When this sort of thing happens, and when stores like Spars are affected, it has very real world consequences. So this is quite a significant sort of so what story. You might think, oh, well, so what, a few Spars had to close or weren't able to take cash payments. That's actually a massive, and not just inconvenience, that's a massive impact on lives for an awful lot of people. And I think we need to remember that.
Exactly, Peter. I know when I used to go on holiday as a child, we used to go to a fairly remote place in down south. I think it was Devon or Dorset, somewhere at that end. And literally the main shop for this town we were holidaying in was in fact a spa, and it wasn't one of the small spas either. It was quite a sizable spa, and like you say, had this happened at that time, the nearest, it wasn't even the nearest town, you had to go to the nearest kind of city where there was a big Morrison's or Tesco's or whatever. And so you can definitely see how this can affect many more people than kind of on the surface.
Indeed, and I think also it's a bit of a kick to, all retailers at the moment are struggling a little bit with supply chains. They'll be struggling to make sure that the shelves are as fully stocked as they should be. They'll be struggling to make sure that the full range that their customers usually expect is indeed there and available. I mean, certainly the big retailers are struggling, let alone smaller ones like Spar, where in particular it's more difficult to keep their stores stocked anyway. So because of the logistics and the distances. So again, when it's like you might be struggling to keep all your customers happy, and then they go and turn up at the door and find that either the store's closed or it's surprise, surprise, cash only. It's just a further, bit of a kicking really to the people that rely on those stores. Very often, actually, there's a good degree of goodwill that customers usually feel to the providers of these stores, because they know full well that without that, there is then nothing in their local community. So it is therefore just incredibly frustrating to find that then they haven't been able to sort of do things like accept the payments that they ordinarily would do. And as you quite rightly say, Amelia, we all rely so much now on previously chip and pin, and now increasingly contactless card payments. Indeed, it's becoming quite a rarity that you actually end up leaving the house with any cash in the back pocket at all. So it just kind of illustrates, as I say, the impact on so many people when the payments go down for a network like this.
Precisely. And so moving on to our next story for today, kind of sticking with the loose topic of finances. A major financial settlement has been paid to Sienna Miller after the phone hacking kind of scandal. And this is an admission of illegal activity by the Sun, the court has heard. So I'm not quite so familiar with this case, because I believe at the time this particular hacking occurred, I was 3. So I will just nicely and gently hand that over to Peter.
Thanks, Amelia. That's a wonderful reminder to any of our older listeners and viewers that the generations advance all the time. I felt this story actually bookended quite nicely. We were talking about Meghan Markle and her privacy case last week, and this case with regards to the Sun and Sienna Miller again highlights the sometimes rather unsavoury behaviour of Britain's tabloid press. They went and published Meghan Markle's letter in that case that we were looking at last week. In this instance, for the better part of a decade, and this incident indeed happened in 2004, for the better part of a decade, the Sun, the News of the World, now defunct due to its practices like this, and other newspapers, I hasten to add, not just the News International ones, the Murdoch ones, were engaged in phone hacking. And for those who are wondering, well, what does that mean? Frequently, journalists would get hold of a celebrity or prominent person's mobile phone number, and they would also then acquire the PIN code for that phone, meaning that they could call the voicemail account for that phone number, and if you put in the PIN, you could then listen to that person's private voicemails. And certainly in this instance, people like Sienna Miller, who was incredibly high profile in the mid 2000s, they'd want to find out about her personal life, where she was going, who she was seeing, how long she was out for, who was leaving messages. In the days before being able to do GPS tracking and posts on Twitter and Instagram, journalists would routinely use private investigators to hack into the mobile phone, and then information that they overheard on those voicemail messages would then find its way into the press coverage, and the individuals would be left thinking, how on earth has someone found that out? And very often they'd be left feeling very vulnerable and paranoid, to be honest, because they'd be wondering, how have the press got over this information? Who is leaking this information? And you'd end up thinking, because very often people couldn't even conceive of the fact that this is what the newspapers were doing. So you start to think, it must be my friend. It must be the person that I was out with. It must be someone that saw me. Are they camped outside? You know, is this the journalist going through my rubbish? And so it made people immensely paranoid and fearful. And that's one of the reasons why now, some 10 years after all this stuff was first uncovered, News International is still dealing with these claims from these individuals and making significant payouts as a result. Just one final point on this is that, and again, this sort of ties into the royal story from last week. Any keen royal watchers will have seen that the BBC recently did a documentary on the press coverage of the princes, William and Harry, and they actually went into some detail on the press coverage at this time, because it turned out that the tabloid press would really harass both William and Harry and anyone who was associated with them. So Kate Middleton, before she was engaged to William, would find her phone hacked multiple times a day. Indeed, there was one weekend, I think it was a Valentine's weekend, something like 100 times her voicemail was accessed by journalists who were wanting to hear Valentine messages from William or anyone else for that matter, or anything associated with it, or even a tip-off, so they'd know where they could then go and see if she was being invited for dinner. You'd find the information from the voicemail, for example. So we know that in that instance, that was what it was. Things like that press coverage that meant that the princes always had a very uneasy relationship with the media, given what happened to their mother, Princess Diana. And in the instance with Harry, he became very paranoid because any girl that he would then spend any time with would face this same intolerable scrutiny, have their mobile phone hacked, have journalists following them all over the place, and sure enough, they'd very often go, sorry, I simply can't put up with this. And that's why he was then very protective when he eventually met Meghan Markle. So it's interesting when you sort of weigh this story, as I say, the Sienna Miller one, with recent stories in the press. This is not the last phone hacking case that we will see settled. News International has set aside millions of pounds of a war chest, hundreds of millions, to deal with payouts for claims like this, and we will continue to see an awful lot more of them in the coming years.
Exactly, it'll be interesting to see and who else comes forward and how much of that money does eventually get paid out.
Indeed, though, because liability is not really an issue in this instance, it very much comes down to just how much is paid out in the award. So it comes down to the individual establishing exactly how much their privacy may have been affected, and how indeed there may have been consequential losses that flowed from the fact that their privacy was being compromised to such an extent. But certainly a huge amount has already been paid out in the hundreds of millions, and hundreds of millions more will continue to be paid out. As I say, not just by News International, but other major newspaper publishers in the UK as well. The UK has had this problem and is going through it. For those in other countries, I just think, I wonder if this was going on there as well. Just ask yourself that question when it comes to this is the same technology that's being used the world over. So we're going through this here. Could it be happening in other countries? More than likely.
So on that note, we'll move on to our next story. So this is regarding malware, which has been masquerading as a legitimate Google Play Store apps. So over 300,000 Android users have downloaded banking Trojan malware disguised as apps that evade detection in Google Play Store. So the malware masquerades as legitimate apps, including QR scanners, fitness trackers, PDF scanners, and cryptocurrency apps. To the point where actually in one case the app had 50,000 downloads, as well as positive reviews, which is a little bit strange. So I'll pass this one over to Peter.
Thanks, Amelia. There used to be a credit card, and it's the advertising slogan was, "What's in your wallet?" And I think it's a question that really a lot of users need to say in terms of what's on your phone. just think quite carefully about all the apps that you've got on there. I think it's always worth doing a quick review, and if there's an app you haven't used for a while, get rid, because you never know what other information it might be collecting and squirreling away. You never know that it could be looking at your transactions, it could be taking your GPS data and sending it somewhere, or it could be installing ransomware on the device that gives hackers the opportunity to see what's going on your device, where you're going, what you're doing. So I think it's always worth asking the question, where did that app come from? During the course of the last 18 months, I'm sure everyone will have at some point downloaded a QR code scanner, because you can use the NHS app to scan QR codes when you're going into a location, which we've had to do as part of the restrictions at different points along the line. But also increasingly, QR codes are being used to provide information, provide links, so that you can then potentially access information, go to a web page, download a document, etc. And in that instance, I think very often you just type in QR code scanner, and on Google Play that could give you a range of dozens of the things, and you're just going to download the one that seems reputable. And in this instance, as you say, Amelia, even if you see one that's a bit dodgy or has got malware on it, it could have positive reviews, 5 stars, wonderful product from someone. So I think it's quite this really is a reminder, as I say, just to take a look and think what's on your phone. A particular indicator that you might have apps that are doing more than they should be in the background is if your mobile phone battery goes down quite rapidly. Particularly if you've got a newer handset and it should be retaining its charge well. If it keeps on running out and you actually aren't touching the phone that much, that's an indicator that you may have apps on there that have got malware or the potential to have ransomware on there. And therefore it is prudent in that scenario to think, actually go through, perhaps there are free apps you can get, like Komodo, for example, that will do a scan of other apps and indeed a scan of your phone to see if there's anything nasty on there. And indeed, most operating systems now will have the ability to scan for viruses, threats, dodgy apps, etc. So it's definitely worth doing that on a pretty regular basis. If you are in the habit of downloading a lot of apps, it could be that you like games or whatever, and you're downloading things on a regular basis, then if you are downloading things on a regular basis, an even bigger reason just to stop and spend a little bit of time sometimes getting rid of the apps you don't need, doing a bit of a clear out, and making sure there's nothing nasty and nefarious working away on your phone there. Because the more you use your phone, the more you rely on it for things like payments, the more you use it to communicate with family and friends, the more that information could actually be, without you knowing it, falling into the hands of hackers.
Continuing with that kind of theme of hackers, according to the NCSC, so that's the National Cybersecurity Centre, they have released a figure that 935% increase in a double extortion ransomware attack since 2020. So this trend has been reported from the group IB, analysing criminal activity, which has revealed a 935% increase in the number of double extortion ransomware attacks compared to the same period in 2020. So in this kind of attack, the malicious actor exfiltrates the stolen data before they encrypt it. They then threaten the victim with the public release of the data, which is very often sensitive, as another way to try and force payment. But the report cautions that even when victims have been kind of paying this ransom, their data nonetheless often ends up published anyway. I'll just pass on to Peter there.
Indeed, thank you, Millie. I think the main thing here is just the sheer size of the rise. I mean, we've seen that there's been almost a pandemic of when it comes to cyber attacks over the course of the last year. With more people working from home, more people being vulnerable, more people spending their time online. But 935% is an incredible figure. We're used to seeing some fairly scary graphs in the course of the last year when it comes to COVID. Well, a 935% increase, that's a pretty scary J-shaped curve in that instance. So it's quite striking to see such a steep, rapid rise, and that merely shows that ransomware is the problem that none of us can ignore. It's therefore important to make sure that you've got systems in place to try and look after your data. It's also a matter of making sure that if the worst happens, you can say to a regulator that you've done all that your organisation could safely and reasonably be expected to do. So more important than ever that you can turn around and demonstrate to your staff, your customers, that you are operating a secure a platform when it comes to either buying and selling goods online or contacting people and marketing and communicating online, to show that you are looking after the data as safely and securely as you possibly can, given your size, given your resources. Because otherwise you don't want to find yourself on the back foot after a ransomware attack, and then potentially facing regulation and enforcement from the ICO or any other regulator, where you may face professional responsibilities as a result.
And I think one of the main things as well is, according to the report, the UK is the third most targeted country after US and only just behind France here. So actually, considering the size of our country, we are being kind of targeted here.
Definitely, and I think it's due to the level of adoption. In terms of many other countries, we spend far more time on our phones. We spend far more time online. We do a bigger proportion of our business online. You know, we do more online shopping. We have more social media users. We have more mobile phone and tablet users than pretty much any other per capita than pretty much any other Western country. So when you've got such a large digital estate as that, therefore you are going to be commensurately more vulnerable. In fact, I was quite surprised to see that we're behind France, to be perfectly honest, given all that. But on this occasion, I think this is one statistic I'm happy to let France be in the lead on that one. Thank you very much.
All right, so that was our final news story for today. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar. And we'll be back next week with hopefully another episode. And just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, podcast channels such as Spotify and Apple Music as well. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again soon.